Yeah, nah, I'm sick of it. I'm sick of all these bike reviewers feeding you absolute BS. In this video, I'm going to prove to you that the StreetFighter V4 is better than the V2 on the road. I don't know what's going on with these bike reviewers. They're all saying the same thing, and they're saying basically this.
Now, the StreetFighter V2 follows in the footsteps of the current V4. That's a leery, high-tech tour de force with a 205 bhp MotoGP derived engine, but it's also a bike that operates at such an otherworldly level that it only really makes sense on track, and that's where the smaller bike comes in.
That is absolute rubbish, okay? The StreetFighter V4 makes more sense on the road, and I'm going to tell you why I got the V4 over the V2, even though I really wanted that V2. That thing is wow. And I believe that sensible minds that have the same information will come up with the same result. So I believe after you listen to this video, you probably agree with me too. Now I've got to say, I love the StreetFighter V2. I want one. I want that green one, please. I mean, it doesn't make sense. I mean, I've got a V4. Why have a V2 as well? But man, I love that bike. But the V4 is better for the street. Now, I just want to address the track thing, saying that the V4 only makes sense on the track, which I will debunk. But I think for 99% of the people, the V2 makes more sense on the track, actually. Because unless you're like MotoGP level of like bike rider, you know, peak physical fitness, I mean, controlling the chaos and wrestling a 200 horsepower, you know, bike around a track, that's for the pros. And it would make much more sense for 99% of us to actually use the V2 on the track. And let's be honest, I doubt we'd even get the most out of the V2 on the track. Now, the first thing I want to address here is the whole thing, 200 horsepower is too much for the road and all this. Well, so is 150 horsepower. In fact, 100 horsepower is probably too much for the road. I have the Tuono 660. That had 100 horsepower. In second gear, I broke every speed limit in, you know, Australia. So 100 horsepower is too much for the road when you really think about it. So the reality is 100, 150, 200 horsepower is too much for the road if you're talking about using that top end and using the, you know, the absolute maximum out of these motors. And by the way, who actually says with this idea that because a bike has so much horsepower, you have to use absolutely every bit of it or you're not getting value out of it? I'm going to tell you why you get value out of using such a powerful engine, even though you're not going to use the top end, especially in the V4, not so much in the V2. First things first, let's just talk with the low-hanging fruit. So this is the V4 versus the V2. So the V4 has a better TFT display. It's bigger. That makes it better for the road. The V4 has a better seat. I mean, makes it more comfy, right? Better for the road. The V4 has better switches, like the instrument switches, you know, for going through all the modes, the indicators and that. They're better on the V4. Makes it better for the road. You have beefier brakes on the V4. You have styliner, bigger discs, like 330mm versus 320, so better brakes. Guess what? That makes it better for the road. Like the brakes, the suspension is actually beefed up more on the V4, stiffer springs. So the suspension is better. It needs to be stiffer because of the extra braking force and, you know, more torque, etc. And you also have the option of the electronic suspension. So again, that makes it better for the road. But even though I've gone through all those things, and I've actually probably think I've forgot about some other things that make it better for the road, that is still not the main reason the V4 is better. Now, some of you might think, well, the V2 is smaller, lighter, more nimble. No, it's not. 200 kilograms, basically both of them. I think actually the V4S is a little bit lighter than the V2. I mean, it's a kilo here or there, like whatever, it really doesn't matter. But we can take off the table that the V4 is lighter and more nimble. It's not. So all those things straight away make the V4 better than the V2 for the road. But now let's get into the real reason the V4 is better for the road and makes more sense on the road. Now, the reason I got the V4 is because, one, I wanted to scratch that itch. And what I mean by that is, like, I got a Tuono 660. I actually didn't want that. I bought that for my wife. That bike scared her, so she likes my other bike, my Royal Enfield, so she's happy to ride that. So the Tuono 660, long story short, it's a bit too small for me, physically I'm talking about, so I thought I'd trade that because it wasn't going to, you know, take that much of a hit because I got it on a discount. And the V4 is just like the perfect size for me. And that's another thing too, it's like bigger too, right, the V4, so that's better as well. That's better for a bigger person like me. But what I mean by scratch that itch, why I got the V4, because I was thinking 100 horsepower Tuono 660, eventually I go to a 150 horsepower with, the V2. Yeah, I'll probably get used to that, and maybe I want to go another step again, right? Let's just cut that crap out. I go to the V4. I'm one and done now. I've scratched that itch. I don't have to go anymore. There is no more to go anyway, really. Once you get to 200 horsepower, I mean, who cares? And I could go to 220 really if I wanted to with an exhaust, etc. But no, 200 horsepower is enough. It's all over. But that's not the main reason. The main reason is because you go to a V4 and you go to a bigger capacity engine, you get the other benefits other than the big horsepower. And the main thing is the torque. You get power everywhere with that V4. And we're going to go into the dyno charts, and it will just prove to you how much better this V4 is for the road than the V2. And it makes much more sense on the road, because the V2, to get the best out of it, you're really going to have to go to that top end. And the V4 really doesn't matter. You can go into the canyons, you can be riding around in any gear, it doesn't matter, it's going to pull, no problems. With the V2, you're probably going to have to be in the right gear in the right corner, even if you're going around town, just, commuting. If you're in the wrong gear with the V2, you will have to change down. With the V4, not so much. It's got so much torque low down, and in fact, it has that much torque low down compared to the V2 that it's got the maximum amount of torque that the V2 has in total at its lower RPM. Whereas, to get that 100 newton meters of torque with the V2, you have to get into the higher rev range, whereas the V4 you don't have to. And then you got that extra torque on top of that, the extra 20 newton meters more that it has than the V2. The V4 has at the top end, but you don't have to be at the top end to get that delicious torque, whereas the V2 you do. So let's have a look at the dyno. Here is the big reason you get the V4 over the V2. Now let's have a look at power and torque. Unfortunately, DUCATI haven't done the exact same chart. There's a bit of difference here, but we can work it out. If we just have a look at the raw figures there, we're talking 208 horsepower versus 153. That's not what we want to talk about. The top end is just unreachable on the road for both of them, but we want to talk about the torque. 123 newton meters on the V4 on the right, and on the left 101 newton meters on the V2. Now it does say there the RPMs on the V2, so at 9,000 RPM the V2 reaches 100 newton meters of torque. But have a look at the torque curve, okay? So on the street, what do you use? You're using about 3 to 8,000, 9,000 RPM. That's what you're using on the street all the time. Have a look how flat the torque curve is between 3,000 up to 8,000, where it starts to pick up with the torque. We're talking about the torque here. Have a look on the V2. The V2's on the left, remember? Everything is at the top end, right? So the V2 doesn't really start to boogie until after 8,000 RPM. Now you may say that's sort of true of the V4 on the right as well, but we can work out the V2 has 100 newton meters of torque, and you can see it there at around 9,000 RPM. So that means at 4,000 RPM to about 7,500 RPM, you have less than half of that newton meters of torque. So you can imagine it's got about 45 newton meters of torque from 4,000 to about 7,500, if their chart is correct. Obviously, it's been vague with the torque. I think this is probably on purpose there. But if we have a look at the V4, it actually does state newton meters on the right. So we can see there at just before 10,000 RPM, you get over 120 newton meters of torque. That's where it peaks. But the important thing here is below 5,000 RPM, we have still over 80 newton meters of torque. That's around 90 newton meters of torque at below 5,000 RPM. So when you're riding on the road, everything's about torque. When you're in the canyons, it doesn't matter what gear you're in, you're pulling, you're using the torque. From this chart on the right with the StreetFighter V4, you can see at around 6,000 RPM, it has the total amount of newton meters of torque at that 6,000 RPM as the V2 has in total at its peak torque figures. So think about that. Pretty much from 5,000 RPM, you got all the torque that the V2 has. And then that torque climbs all the way to around, 10,000 RPM. This is where the big difference is. This is why it makes much more sense on the road. You can see there the StreetFighter V2. To get the torque, to get the power out of it, you're going to have to be at the top end. Whereas you have all that low down, delicious torque with the V4. Basically from about, 5,500 or 6,000 RPM, you have the total that the V2 has there. And remember this, they actually limit the torque in the V4. because it would just be too unrideable if you had like full torque in first and second gear. They actually limit the torque in first and second. They give you a bit more torque in third and fourth, but it's still slightly limited, and then they give you the full power up the top. So imagine it wasn't limited, the torque in the V4. Like, there is no comparison here. On the road, the V4 makes much more sense. So anyway, I hoped I helped you out here. Do you agree there? Both of these bikes are awesome, but I mean, look, the V4 is just better for basically everything. So anyway, catch you in the next one. Tally ho.